I'm excited to be here. Thank you for inviting me. It's an exciting talk and time for me because it'll be the last talk I ever give as a postdoc. I have just one more week and then I'm starting a new job in industry at a startup related to disease research. So I thought, what should I talk about? And I had told Sam I was going to talk about open science. And I think more generally, I just want to tell people here things that I've found that have been useful for, my past decade in academia and doing research. So yeah, I wanted to start off talking about reproducibility and how you can make your science more reproducible. And this information, I guess, is largely focused towards computational research, basically anything you can do on a computer. I think there are some lessons that translate to, say, more hands-on experimental research. And, I'm happy to take questions. I want you to type your questions into the box whenever you have them. And I will keep talking until my time is done, but I'd really like to make this more interactive and talk about things that you're interested in. So even if it's a little bit off topic, put it in as a question and I would love to talk about it. But starting with computational research, one thing that makes it unique is that everything you do on a computer can be recorded. So theoretically, if you're doing computational research, that means that your science should be it's able to be 100% reproducible because you can record it all. But that doesn't come automatically. You have to take steps to make that happen. And so at the beginning here, I'm going to tell you what some of those steps are. One thing I find very helpful are notebooks. So you may have heard of these as Jupyter notebooks, which is a type of notebook that started in Python, but actually works for many different programming languages. And what notebooks do is they allow you to mix documentation. Like, for example, here we have a title. We also can have code blocks. So here you have some Python code. And you can also have output. So, for example, this second cell, it reads in a data set and it shows you the shape of the data set. So the numbers of rows are 8,000 and the number of, does that make, yeah, I think it's rows first and probably columns. So 20,000 columns. It must be, it's a matrix of genes. There's 20,000 human coding or protein coding human genes. And you can also have outputs like showing the first two rows of a table. So this is a very convenient way of having code interspersed with outputs. And you can also have visualizations and figures like this. So the main benefit, I would say, of notebooks is for most researchers, you have workflows where you are doing some coding or are doing some operations, but in between them, you need to see the data you're handling and the data you're working with. So notebooks let you intersperse that all in a way that lets viewers know what's going on. And if you come back to in many months, lets you know what's coming on. Here, that was a Jupyter notebook. This is an R Markdown notebook. So if you program in the language R, it may look more like this, but it's similar where you can have documentation and images and code all mixed in. And this notebook here has more documentation. I think sometimes people underestimate the importance of documentation, not just for other people, but also for yourself, because I made this, R Markdown document during my PhD probably 7 years ago. And if I just had the code and none of the documentation, I would probably look at it now and have very little idea of what was going on. But if I look at it and I see the documentation, now I actually can remember. So, if you're going to be doing research for a long time, don't rely on your internal memory. Try to write down everything and especially write down stuff on something that gets put on the internet, so you can just use Google to find it to recollect your memory. A few words of caution regarding using notebooks. Because notebooks have these cells and you can kind of run one cell and then jump back to a previous cell, it sometimes is possible to get in a state that is different than what would have happened if you just ran the notebook sequentially. So before, say, you publish a notebook or really rely on it as having an authoritative result, make sure to restart it and run all the cells. And finally, you may have a project that has many notebooks. In fact, almost all my projects are not just a single notebook, they're a pipeline of notebooks. So you can create what's called a script, or just a way to run all of those notebooks in a certain order. And we have a question which I'll address now. How much motivation rather than good design do you depend on to keep up good practices? So, for example, am I doing documentation because I'm motivated to do it? I think at the beginning, it takes maybe a little, it definitely takes extra effort at the beginning, but the value should become clear. And I guess for me, I'm motivated to produce works of value, and you can create amazing code or amazing research, but if no one can really look at it and reuse it, I would say oftentimes it has quite limited value, especially if you're in the business of, say, making data sets or other findings that people are supposed to reuse. And if you look at the scientific projects that really have blown up and succeeded to a huge degree and perform and provide really useful resources to the community, they usually have good documentation. Some of them don't, but they would be even bigger if they did have good documentation. So hopefully that answers that question. So the next piece of advice I have relates to files and directories. So directories, you may have also heard of the name folder. And one piece of advice I like to give when naming files that have to do something with a date or time is to use the ISO 8601 standards. So what that means is using 4 digits for the year, 2 digits for the month, and 2 digits for the day. And I tend to put this at the beginning of my files if it's a type of file that where the date is important. So, sometimes the date is important, sometimes it's not. But if it's like an experiment that happened on a certain day and you want to be able to order that with all your other experiments, usually the date is something you want. And by using this format for the date, if you sort these alphabetically, the files will be arranged in a date. And it's also very easy to say process with a programming language, because you can say, well, if I can split it on this underscore and get the first part, and that will be just the date. Or say, for example, the first 10 or so characters are the date. And what's nice about this is, science is a global thing. And in the US here, most people use this weird date format, which is locale dependent and isn't the same in Europe. And that messes a lot of things up. It's actually, there are ambiguous dates in the US or in many places. So if you use this standard, it's the international standard, and scientists should adopt these international standards. Sometimes it makes sense to order things sequentially, not by date, but by some order, like numbers. So for example, here I have 3 notebooks, and I prefix them with 01, 02, 03. This allows them to be sorted. And I find it helpful when you're looking in a folder to have all the files in the right order. You'll notice here the 0 before the 1. That can be helpful because eventually you'll probably get to 11. And if you don't do this, it might go 1, then 11, then 2. So if you think you're going to have hundreds of files, you should put 2 leading zeros here. Actually, something I don't show here, but that I've started doing is possibly I'll start with the first file being 10 and the second one being 20. And that makes it easier in the future for me to say make 25 if I want to insert a notebook in the pipeline. So these are just ideas to keep in mind when you're naming your files. The next topic is version control, which basically means keeping track of the version of all the files for a certain project. And as a you could imagine just having a folder here, and this folder just has a bunch of files. And kind of when I started doing research, this may have been all I had. And if I wanted to go back to some past version or know when I changed something, I wouldn't actually have that information. But now there are solutions like Git, which allows you to have a history of all the changes. So this is the Git log, and each commit here is essentially like a snapshot. And it has information such as the date the snapshot was taken, which is not shown in this log, but it exists. It has information on the author, and it has what's called the commit message, which is the why you made the changes. So people can look at the changes that are in the file, but the commit message says, what was the purpose of making those changes? And using this, it helps you understand what you did in the past and why. Now, Git is for computer code and text files. I get probably the industry standard at this point. It does have a steep learning curve. So perhaps there are other solutions that would work well for you if you're not in to making code. But if you are making code, I think it is worth the time to learn it. GitHub is a nice website that puts a pretty interface, an online interface, on a Git repository. So for example, we had this folder here and I was looking at it on my computer. I made it into a Git repository, and now you can view it on GitHub and go through the files there. GitLab is another service that is similar and actually has the benefit that more of its code is open source. So once you have something on a site like GitHub or GitLab, something becomes possible called code review. And this is the idea that when you make a change to your research, you can ask someone else to review it. So for example, in the Greene lab at the University of Pennsylvania that I'm currently part of, Greg Way here proposed some changes and asked me to review it. And I made my review. I think I suggested some changes, and then Greg made those changes and then officially accepted this new version into the repository. So this is helpful, say, if you're working with someone in your lab on a project. It can be helpful to have them review the code or them review the changes. You can use this for more than code. You can use it for documentation and even just general files. So now we've talked about keeping track of the files you've had, but an also important thing is keeping track of the programs that you use to run your analysis. And this is what people call a computational environment. And kind of, I did this study that Sam briefly mentioned. The title was Lung Cancer Incidence Decreases with Elevation, Evidence for Oxygen as an Inhaled Carcinogen. And I made all the code public. But a few years after I made it public, a user commented on GitHub that they tried to use the code, but they got an error. And this was R. If you've ever used R, sometimes the errors are not that informative. But it's a very esoteric error, and this is a kind of error message that's very hard to debug. So as a side note, if you're making error messages for your user, try to make them a little bit more helpful than this. But at this point, I had no idea what it was. And it turned out that one of the packages had changed versions from what I had used to run it to what the online user had tried. And these problems tend to take years to show up. So if you make some code, it'll probably work tomorrow. It may work in a month, but it almost definitely won't work in 2 years unless you have the exact same laptop and or computer and haven't done anything else on it and haven't updated anything. So you need to control the programs in an environment. And when you make a research project, it's best practice now to specify what versions of programs you need. So there are a few projects that make it easier to do this, to take note of all the packages that you have and share those packages with other people. One of those tools is named Conda, which started with Python, but actually works for programs of any type. And a more heavyweight one is also called Docker. And Docker is sort of like the ultimate way of managing a computational environment. It's almost like you can send an operating system to someone else with all the right packages installed. For specific languages, there's also a lot of other programs. Right now, I'm most familiar with Python, where there's projects like pipenv and Poetry, which do similar things. So what you need probably depends on what you're working with and what your goals are. Next, I want to talk about open source. And I think open source is actually the foundation for a lot of research and a lot of what I've talked about. But the main idea here is that when you make code and research outputs, that other people can reuse that code and modify it. And a lot of researchers, I guess, kind of assume that just because they put something on the internet, or say maybe as a supplement or an appendix to their article, that it is open source. But that's not true. And the reason it's not true is because by default, whenever you create something, it's subject to copyright. And that copyright means that other people can't copy it in its most basic sense, or they can't modify it and share the modified version. So just because you've shared maybe your research data or your research code, that doesn't mean that it's reusable by others. Furthermore, depending on your situation, it's likely that the university you're at, if you're at a university, or even if you're at a company, they probably own, or they may own the rights to what you create. And they can place additional legal barriers, say, when they share that online. We have some questions. I'm going to get to those right after this section. So my recommendation is to release your scientific outputs under an open license. Here I show the symbol for CC0, which essentially waives all copyright. I think this is a great choice for data because it's kind of questionable how copyright applies to data. And in general, people just assume you can use data how you want, and this kind of removes any possibility of legal barriers to that. For software, there's actually probably better licenses like the BSD 2-clause license or the MIT license. And these are what allow people to reuse your data. And it's a very powerful paradigm, not just in research, but also in computing. So for example, right now I'm using the Linux operating system, which is entirely open source and powers a lot of the heavy computing done. So it's pretty incredible, the power of open source. Also, if you're at a university and potentially they own it, you should get permission from them before putting on a license, because the license really is only valid if the owner puts it on. An alternative is if you're writing a grant, commit to openness, because when you write a grant, it's actually the university, they're approving it, and they're contractually and legally bound by it. So if you say in a grant that you're going to release the outputs under an open license, then you don't necessarily have to get permission from, your technology transfer office at the university once you make it. So this is a great time for this question is, how can we apply this kind of rigor and mindset to the experimental side of biology, like wet lab? There's an acronym I don't know, IRL. It makes it hard, but can you imagine a way? And
it's in real life.
In real life.
I think it's that.
So I think when you're doing wet lab, you have some portion of your research that essentially occurs outside of computers. And that's, say you working with cells and applying, just all these essentially wet lab operations yourself. But they produce results that are digital. Most results these days are digital. So results could be data measurements, they could be images, which you then look at. And so I think what you have to do is track digital results as soon as you can and keep track of them. So for example, if every time you get a new result, you add that to, say, a repository, and you have a history of how all the results were in the past and all the results are now, that's fantastic. And if there's ever a question about your data or, when or where something came from, you can immediately find that. So if you're doing wet lab, I think, there always is going to be some stuff that really happens outside of the computer. But as soon as it gets into the computer, you have all of this sort of versioning available to you. And I think, probably it's fair to say that most wet lab researchers don't use it to its fullest extent now, and may just say, keep an Excel document where if they accidentally press delete, some data could go away and they may never realize it. So yeah, you want systems that are robust against accidents and also have a good amount of transparency, so you can remember what you did and that you are really protected against any allegations of wrongdoing or misconduct, because you've been transparent from the start. And if someone has a question, they can just look back at the history. We have another question that sometimes I find myself spending way too much time to learn a new tool or fix some version control bug. Any advice on balancing reproducibility and over reproducibility? And yeah, that's a great question. I think it's important to think of what solutions are going to give you the greatest benefit and do those first. So, this may be a situation where you have a hard drive full of 1,000 files and you don't know what any of those files really are. And so version control is not your biggest issue. Organizing things into directory and, naming things properly and making maybe readmes, which say what each file is perhaps your most urgent need. I guess another piece of advice here is try to adopt. It's better to learn one thing and one thing well than to potentially learn 3 things. So, and maybe have none of them stick. So if, if you're just looking to get into it, I would suggest learning whatever the industry standard is or whatever is most widely adopted, because that's going to have, say, the best support online, the most questions on a site like Stack Overflow, and will be the most likely to be around in a few years and actively used. So, for example, that would mean if you're trying to get into version control, you should learn Git rather than Mercurial. And that's not to say there's anything wrong with Mercurial. It just didn't end up becoming as widely adopted as Git did. So next, I want to talk briefly about Manubot, which is a project I started, and it's really more tailored towards computational people who are already using Git and GitHub. And what it is, it's a workflow and set of tools for the next generation of scholarly publishing. It allows you to write your manuscripts on Markdown. If you're not familiar, Markdown's a way of writing text that can be formatted. You've probably seen it on Reddit or GitHub issues, and you can track this with Git, and it automatically create a manuscript. So kind of the goal is to move beyond the PDF, to have papers appear as HTML and websites foremost, and also to have a history that's very transparent. One feature of ManuBot is that it has citation by persistent identifier. So you can write a sentence like this, where you say you cite a DOI, which is a way of identifying a paper. You cite maybe a PubMed ID, a PubMed Central ID, an archive ID, and a URL. And kind of the idea here is you no longer need a reference manager, because most things you cite have persistent IDs. And all the metadata for these persistent IDs can be fetched from various places. So when you write manuscripts these days, you really only need to put in the identity of what you want to cite and not all of the metadata, because that can be automatically generated and turned into something like this in an entirely automated way. So if this interests you, you can look at some of the works that have already been made with ManuBot, and read more about how to create one yourself. So for, here's another example, and we tried to make it kind of shiny and have nice features like that. So this is the end of this presentation, but it's not the only presentation I have for you today. So we'll move on to the next one, but I will answer this one question here. And it's about, I mentioned that I am finishing my working at a startup. The name of the startup is Related. The website is related.vc. Anyways, the question is, I want to know more about the move to industry. Any particular reason you made your move to explore outside academia? And I think I tried to think about, what do I get the most joy from? And I get the most joy from creating high quality resources that other people can use. And while I've been doing that in academia, I didn't necessarily, I saw that if I were to go, say, the traditional faculty route and become a professor, there were a lot of barriers that would make it hard for me to focus 100% on just creating useful and reusable research. And part of that was the time you have to spend getting grants. And I guess a PI these days having a lot of sort of management as part of the role. And I thought maybe I could focus more in industry. But on the other hand, I love in academia how you can make your work open, and you can really feel that your work is contributing to the state of knowledge and the public domain of knowledge. So that being said, it wasn't just like I could do any industry job. And the one I ended up finding, I hope and I think that they do a large amount of their work in an open source way. So I think I can get a lot of the aspects that I enjoyed in academia in the context of this startup. But given that I haven't actually done it yet, who knows, maybe I'll come back in a year and say I was wrong. But at the moment, that's my thinking.
I just wanted to add a question, because it really struck me what you just said. It's a reflection I made myself. When some people find that the open science kind of believers are maybe just cynical about the scientific project and the real nature of how science happens, that it does happen over a generation, an idea will survive the test of time or not. I don't believe that to be true. I think that science needs to be changed, but maybe I'm wrong. And it's that same thing that you just said there, that like, oh, maybe I'm wrong. The industry is the grass is greener over there. And I was wondering, do you have a counter to the state as is actually the best system, or is a very good system, and open science is not a better option?
Yes, so I don't think you can, categorically say the grass is greener on either side. I think industry sometimes does good science, and academia sometimes does good science. Kind of what disturbs me is I think a lot of the time academia doesn't do good science, and probably industry doesn't do good science either. And when I look at where academia does the worst science, I tend to think that is when it is the least open, and a lot of the biggest problems in academia would be mitigated by more openness. I mean, probably a lot of the bad science comes out because there are incentives to, make it seem like you're making a lot of scientific output, even if it's not of the highest rigor or quality. And there are incentives in terms of career advancement to, pretend you're doing good work, but focus more on polishing something than actually making something good at the foundation. And so I would like to see incentives change. So instead of, people evaluating scholars just based on publications, they actually look at what they did and what they made and whether that was rigorous and of high quality, rather than just looking at journal prestige. I guess I think open science will help accelerate the ability to do that. I don't know if I answered your question, so.
Yeah, I was just going to say, sorry that I didn't keep my face. It's just I didn't want to interrupt too much, but I recognize that not having my face might have made a bit awkward to reply. I was just carry on. Yeah, but it's a good answer. Thanks.
So let's see. I have this slide up about Sci-Hub, and why I'm putting it here is kind of when I started science, and probably to many people in the audience, the thing that made the least sense was how we did this research that was publicly funded, that we wanted to disseminate, that we wanted to get the ideas out there, but then we would publish them in journals whose business model was to deprive access from people and try to make them pay, with the vast majority of the world being unable to read what we wrote. And this is especially damaging in the environment where people don't release much about their science besides a publication. So essentially, almost the entire output of a lot of science is behind paywalls. And, I know why we have this system. It's just that it kind of made more sense when journals were print and there was a cost to distributing them. It's a sort of a system we inherited, but that today really doesn't make much sense when you realize that, with open access, you can have all of the same quality, but with the benefit of having a lot more people, having your work be reusable and visible to the public. So I'm very excited for the day when all publicly funded science is published in an open access way. And I would encourage you to, try not to publish in a way where you have to sign away your rights to the work and send your work to a journal that's going to deprive it from being viewed by the public. This is kind of where Sci-Hub comes in. Sci-Hub is a website made by a woman, Alexandra Elbakian, who is from Kazakhstan. And it is essentially maybe like a Napster for PDFs. So you can put in the DOI or URL for a scientific work, and it will most likely give you the PDF, even if that article is behind a paywall. And this is, copyright infringement. Sci-Hub essentially has found ways to obtain these PDFs that it's not legal, say in the US or in most jurisdictions, the way Sci-Hub obtains these PDFs. But they are, they are the only way that many researchers can access literature. So one interesting thing about Sci-Hub is I think it makes the subscription model kind of irrelevant. And we see libraries are now canceling their big deals with publishers. And I think part of that is because the librarians know that people will be able to use Sci-Hub to access the literature, even if that's potentially illegal. And my hope is that this gets rid of subscription publishing as soon as possible, so that we can have a fully open system of publishing, which has a lot of other benefits, like the ability to do large-scale text mining in a way that's not possible. So even though Sci-Hub gives you PDFs, it would be much better if all science were actually openly licensed and reusable. But maybe Sci-Hub is what will make that kind of an inevitability. Anyways, so I did a study, and we found that 85% of all toll access articles are already in Sci-Hub. So it seems like this resource has kind of already broken down the paywall. But moving on to another topic, here I want to talk a little bit about how the conversation of science happens and will happen in the future. This is a paper we wrote. This is kind of viewing it in its traditional journal article interface. And, maybe one thing you notice is that it has a lot of authors with 33 affiliations. Here's the preprint. So essentially, this was just something we posted to BioRxiv before it was accepted by the journal. I would still at this point call this more traditional science. This was the most viewed BioRxiv preprint of 2017. And I think that was not only because it was about deep learning, which was a hot topic, but because we got a breadth of perspectives. We had 33 different authors, maybe more, maybe 36 authors from 33 different places. And so how was this possible? It's that we wrote this paper online on GitHub, actually using Manubot. Manubot didn't exist at this point. This was the project that we created Manubot to support. But I just want to give an idea of the importance of open online collaboration and the power of it. So at the beginning, we had a few people who were writing sections. So this was a review paper, and oftentimes someone would come and say, maybe write 1 or 2 paragraphs. And as time went on, you see time on the y-axis and contributors on the x-axis. You can see more people joined. Some of the old contributors remained active and new contributors came in, and time progressed until we had all 33 of these contributors, and some people coming back month after month to make changes. We use GitHub Issues, which is like a forum, which was a convenient spot for discussing papers that we wanted to write about in the review and whether we should write about them. And then something very interesting happened, that these questions started arising. So for example, we had issues which were about other people's paper, and then we would get questions like, do you know whether this paper releases a code or not? And we would have to respond that we're not actually the authors of this paper, that we just made this to discuss the paper. And, is it possible to access the paper implementation? And another question along the same lines. And so what ended up happening is that most papers actually have no place online where you can discuss them. And so people were Googling the paper and they were finding a place where they could comment, and they were commenting there, even though it wasn't really a venue that the authors of the paper even knew about. So I think this shows the importance of, potentially, like, say you have a GitHub repository for your code, that gives people a place to comment. Or if you post a preprint, there's a comment section there. So, when you make research, I think it's also useful to make a place for the conversation to happen. So here is a screenshot of a conversation on BioRxiv. It's really useful how they allow comments, although Discuss is maybe not the best interface for really in-depth discussions, and actually most bioRxiv preprints don't get any comments. In the journal PeerJ, they also have a commenting feature, which actually I found helpful because I noticed an error in one of my publications, and I was able to kind of use this comment feature to just make a comment about the error. And I think this is just way better in general than the core agenda and errata that traditionally you'd have to do for publications, where it doesn't even show up in the original publication. You want the fix and the comment to be right next to where the mistake is. For journals that don't support it, there's something called Hypothesis, which allows you to comment on any website. And so, for example, on eLife actually shows Hypothesis for all of its papers, and I've used it to provide additional information on some areas. Now, PubPeer, there are other sites that kind of allow you to comment on papers that have nothing, that are not run by the journal. So one of them is PubPeer, Pre-Review, and BioOverlay is another one. And I would say, especially as an early career researcher, if you have the opportunity to use one of these, that's very good. I think getting your name out there and showing in a public venue that you have expertise on a topic can really help advance your career. Traditionally, PIs tend to get a lot of the recognition and credit for the work of their employees. And one problem about that is it makes it hard for early career researchers to establish themselves, because it's not very clear what they did and what their level of expertise is compared to their PI's level of expertise. So I think and also as an early career researcher, you probably have more native ability to, say, comment online, and you're more comfortable with online platforms than a lot of people who didn't kind of grow up with the internet as much. So as an early career scientist, I think you have a lot of opportunity to get involved in online things and establish yourself as an independent authority on topics, which hopefully will help you throughout your career. And I know this can be intimidating to a lot of people. So it can help to start small. Even if it's just kind of pointing out a typo, which is what I do in a lot of GitHub projects if I see one, that can be helpful, or just asking a question. But I think soon you can build the confidence, and to comment a lot. And it's okay to be wrong. And I think as scientists, we need to accept that people may make comments and be wrong. And with more conversation, I think a lot of the problems go away. So hopefully we can get to a place where there's more conversation. And I guess a lot of that conversation happens on Twitter these days. People post actually really good scientific analyses and thoughts on Twitter, but it can be kind of problematic because it's really hard to find old tweets. So I think there's a lot of opportunities to use kind of better forums than Twitter, which are a little bit more scientific and scholarly, in that we can go back to them in the future and have more sustained conversation. So with that, I hope people found some of these ideas of mine helpful, and it would be a great time to ask any questions if you have them.
We'll just give people a few instances to pop some things there. We have someone who's sticking their hand up. Yeah, Linda. So Linda, if you just want to turn your cam and mic on, you'll be able to come up on stage. Yeah, sometimes there's a little lag on people coming up.
Okay, we have a
Yeah, we're
question that
waiting.
I can do until Linda gets here. The question is, can you elaborate on Git/GitHub/GitLab? And let me just go to them. So this is my profile on GitLab. So GitLab and GitHub are both websites where you will create a profile and then you can upload your repositories online. You can think of it almost as like a Facebook for code. I don't love Facebook, but basically a place where everyone can look at the same code and discuss it online together. And I guess not just code, but any text file or any set of files. So GitHub is, I guess, has more users than GitLab at this point, especially in terms of like the open source community. But GitHub itself is not an open source project. So for example, Microsoft owns GitHub, and if Microsoft decided that they don't want me having access to GitHub or anyone else, they could shut it off. And that would be kind of a problem. It wouldn't be such a terrible problem because I have a lot of this on my computer in a way I'll describe, but it would be a problem. And now GitLab.com could also make that decision that they don't want me having access. And this actually is a real problem, like countries that the US has sanctioned, like perhaps Iran. I'm not sure they're actually able to use all of these tools. So there is an equity issue here and a centralization problem. But GitLab is open source, which means that if GitLab said I can no longer use GitLab.com, I could set up my own sort of GitLab server. Say your university could set it up, and that would make the migration less painful. So the big advantage of GitLab is that they're built more on open source stuff. But I would say I use GitHub more just because there's more of a user base, so I can have conversations with people easier. And I don't think there's that much of a risk of them just disappearing. And even if they were to disappear, you would still keep all of your code and all of your and all of the files and history that you had uploaded. And that's because that uses Git. So Git is like the program you have on your computer that you are using to track the history of a directory and the files within it. So, GitHub and GitLab, they're essentially online interfaces to show and interact with Git repositories. But the thing that you actually have on your computer is Git.
Kind of, I have, maybe I'll just pop my question and we'll jump over to that one. I was wondering if you have a particular interest in biology, like a topic that you find most interesting, or not. If you don't, that's fine.
Yeah, I guess kind of. It's kind of a big. Well, the topic is taking all biological knowledge and putting it into a network. And this is something I've been trying to do. I created something called HedioNet, which has different types of nodes and edges. So for example, it'll have genes and diseases and compounds. And I wanted to put as much knowledge in one place in a sort of data structure that both a machine could understand and a human can understand. And I thought that networks are that data structure where you can have some formats that a computer can understand really well. Like you could imagine just like a binary, zeros and ones. Maybe that's really good for the computer, but it's terrible for humans. Whereas, humans, something like a PDF is actually pretty good, but it's terrible for a computer because it's hard to extract any of that information. So I've been trying to take knowledge and put it into these networks such that we can make algorithms to assist biologists and to predict, say, what drugs will treat what diseases. So we have another question that what do you think the open source community can do to make it more welcoming to women and minority groups? And I think one thing I've seen, I don't see this as much in science, but in some big open source projects, the discussions can be, people can be kind of defensive and get into essentially arguments on these GitHub issues. And I don't think that's very helpful, because it just saps a lot of time and energy from people, and it makes it, makes these communities kind of less welcoming overall. And I think perhaps to some extent, the people who are like more like maybe blasé and argumentative get involved early on, and maybe that's why it's like that now. I know GitHub has made some new features to say hide comments if they're disruptive, or to lock conversations, and I think that can really help steer conversation in a productive way. So at least for projects where I'm the maintainer, if someone were to exhibit behavior that was I found negative and was making other people not want to be involved, I would maybe hide their comments, or limit their ability to make additional comments, or try tell them not to behave that way in the future. And something that can be helpful for that is a code of conduct. So there's something called a contributor covenant, which you can put in your repository, and it lays out, a code of conduct. And then if someone violates it, you can say, oh, we have this code of conduct, can you please blah, blah, blah. And perhaps that can help. And then I guess, I think mentoring is also an important part, that this is still kind of cutting edge, and it's hard to learn. There's a steep learning curve. So if you have an opportunity to help someone learn this stuff that otherwise may not know it, you should take that opportunity, and really consider, say, diversity and inclusion when doing outreach.
I think the next question we have there is it's very much related, and I think that it's the question that everyone asks. It's like, how do you start? And I think when we speak to people like you, often you don't know how to start because it's been so long. It's almost like asking, how do you teach someone how to walk? But given that, how would you approach getting someone who doesn't know what the terminal is to start being able to just understand what you're saying, and to figure out if they're wasting their time or not?
Well, I guess with programming specifically, I know there are a lot of nice websites to help you learn like languages. Like I think maybe Code Academy is one of them. I don't know if that makes you pay. In general, there's probably enough free stuff on there online now, free resources to learn the just a basic start. But kind of the way that I learn programming is just by doing projects. So start with something simple, like even just a fun project of, oh, I planted a garden and I'm going to take measurements of my plants every week. And then at the end of I'm going to, plot them with the programming language. So maybe in the past you would have done that with Excel, but maybe now you could see if you could do that in R or Python. So start with a really simple task, and you will learn by doing. And I think that's probably, maybe have a little bit of learning through like a tutorial or course, but a lot of the learning is really going to be by doing. And then, if you're just learning, you could spend a lot of time researching what to learn. Should I learn this really new language that people say is really great for this? And probably learn the most established ones first. So, maybe Python or R, maybe Julia but yeah.
Just before we close, I was going to use my privilege as the moderator to indulge. You mentioned that HeteoNet was kind of your attempt to create a network of knowledge, and you've alluded to wanting to use machines to read the scientific literature. Charles Hoyt has kind of done something on a similar kind of idea, and he has this thing, well, not his, but he works with biological expression language and has suggested that we should write nano publications alongside a publication, where it's like the kind of causal claims are in there. I was wondering, what are the challenges or feasibility of having something that summarizes papers into causal statements, and not just that, integrating all we know about what is wrong with the discussion section, or the way that a claim becomes a fact without evidence as it traverses the literature. And I was wondering, do you think about those issues, or is this next level kind of complexity?
A little bit. So here's a visualization of HeteoNet, and the nodes are tiny little white dots, and the edges are lines. And I guess this answer usually surprises people, but the biggest issue when you're starting from nothing is just that all your edges are missing, right? Like, there's so much we don't know about biology. So my first priority was to put in what we know, and definitely a lot of that will be wrong, in that we think we know something but it's wrong, or that someone has said something but it's not actually it's not correct. I view that as a hard problem to solve, and one that is maybe not the most pressing problem to solve, when there's still so much more when there's still so much incompleteness in these networks. But as we become, as we fill in an area of the network to a place where maybe we know 70% of everything that actually is out there, we know 70% of the relationships that truly exist, then you can start thinking about removing the wrong ones. But for most network applications, it's more important to have many correct ones and let a few wrong edges in, or relationships in, than get rid of all incorrect relationships. And with anything, you can always get rid of all false positives by just getting rid of everything. So if you focus on curating stuff too much, you're left with nothing. But I guess in the long term, we do really want a way to say 3 papers say this, 2 papers say this, and now we need to come to a consensus. And I think that's a hard problem, but one that we'll need to solve, but that I don't need to solve yet.
Yeah. All right. So on that note, thank you very much for your time, your presentation. And I think we'll be starting again around 3:30, maybe a little later, for the workshop, the imposter syndrome workshop with Erica Boone. But we'll get a little notification about that shortly. But until then, thank you very much, Daniel, and I'll see you in the waiting room.
Great. Thanks so much.
Cheers.